Jimmy Carter became the 39th President of America in January 1977. Although only elected for one term, he made some outstanding achievements as President. In 1977, he created the Department of Education. In 1980, he signed the Energy Act, bringing the new Department of Energy into existence. He also deregulated the airline, trucking and home brewing industries. He negotiated the Camp David Accords between Egypt and Israel. His administration also developed full diplomatic relations with China. He returned control of the Panama Canal to that nation, and he negotiated the important SALT II treaty with the Soviet Union. He negotiated also the release of American hostages held in Iran, even though that came too late to save his presidency. After the presidency, he wrote several books and won the Nobel Peace Prize for his work on human rights around the world. Carter was born in the small town of Plains in the state of Georgia on the 1st of October 1924. His father, James Earl, developed a huge 5,000-acre peanut farm which employed hundreds of small tenant farmers. As a teenager, Jimmy had little interest in farming but attended the Georgia Institute of Technology. In 1943, at the age of 20, he joined the American Navy Academy and done a bachelor degree in science. In 1946, at the age of 22, he married a school friend, Rosalind Smith. They had 4 children. He worked with the Navy for 10 years, achieving the rank of lieutenant officer. However, in 1953, his father died and Jimmy returned to Plains to run the family business. Over the next few years, he got involved in several local farming and educational committees. He ran for the state Senate of Georgia in the late 60s. However, the corruption system and the counting system, he challenged that legally and forced a rerun and thereby gained statewide publicity for his ability and courage. In 1970, Jimmy Carter ran for and became the governor of Georgia. As governor, he developed a reputation for efficiency and honesty and won the Democratic presidential nomination in 1976 in the aftermath of the Watergate scandal. In relation to foreign affairs, in September 1978, Carter invited the Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and the Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin for peace talks to Camp David just outside Washington. Egypt had lost the Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip to Israel in the Six-Day War of June 1967, and also failed to win them back in the Yom Kippur War a few years later in 1973. Sinai was of crucial importance to Egypt for historical reasons and also for commercial control of the Suez Canal. Carter worked as mediator and broker between the two sides. American involvement, of course, was also crucial in terms of enforcing the agreement afterwards. The negotiations were complex. Israel, however, agreed to give back the Sinai Peninsula in return for Egyptian recognition of Israel as a legitimate sovereign state. Israel also agreed to vacate the West Bank and Golan Heights at a future date. However, they quickly abandoned these commitments. The Camp David Agreement was never fully implemented. In retrospect, it looks like a divide and conquer strategy on the part of Israel. By taking Egypt out of the equation, it left Israel in a much stronger position to pursue its ambitions and expansion plans in the West Bank. Begin and Sadat won the Nobel Peace Prize for their part in the agreement. However, many Arab nations felt betrayed by Egypt's actions, as it failed to honour a previous agreement with other Arab nations. There had been an agreement in 1967 that there would be no peace deal until Israel left all of the occupied territories. Israel continued to control the Gaza Strip, the Golan Heights and the West Bank after the accords were signed. Looking back years later, Carter felt betrayed by Israel's behaviour. The status of the Gaza Strip was later dealt with in the Oslo Accords in 1993 in the Bill Clinton administration. However, the West Bank and Golan Heights continued to be a source of conflict between Israel and its Arab neighbours. This conflict also damaged American-Arab relationships, as Israel could not renege on the agreement without US support. The Arab nations responded with increased oil prices, which hurt the American economy. However, the accords achieved some important objectives. They made both Israel and Egypt strong United States allies in the region. They also split the Arab alliance and weakened the influence of the Soviet Union in the region. However, they also gave rise to the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, in subsequent decades as they tried to force Israel out of the remaining occupied territories. A couple of years later, Sadat was shot dead mainly because of his part in negotiating these accords. In relation to the Soviet Union and Afghanistan, the rivalry between the superpowers had moved to Afghanistan by the 1970s. Carter had appointed Hamilton Jordan as his chief of staff. However, the president also liked to have several senior advisors with free access to him. Sometimes the views of senior advisors clashed with each other, and this was very much the case in the case of the Secretary of State Cyrus Vance and the National Security Advisor Brzezinski. Brzezinski was of Polish origin and had a hatred of the Soviet Union. He urged Carter to take a tough stand against the Soviets. Cyrus Vance, on the other hand, was more diplomatic approach, but he was often sidetracked by Brzezinski, who had briefed the president on a daily basis. Brzezinski hoped to provoke the Soviet Union into invading Afghanistan by the US supporting anti-communist rebels there. On the 3rd of July 1979, Carter approved a military operation known as Operation Cyclone. Here the CIA worked secretly in conjunction with the Pakistan government to support anti-communist forces in Afghanistan. There was also a conflict and rivalry within the Afghan communist movement itself. Hafizullah Amin overthrew and executed President Taraki in Afghanistan in September 1979 and had himself installed as a kind of a left-wing communist. However, Amin could not control the situation there either and lost control of the situation after a few months. And in December, 3 months later, December 79, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. Brzezinski had played a role in creating a Vietnam-type scenario for the Soviets. The Soviets actually got bogged down in Afghanistan for over a decade. They lost billions with over 100,000 soldiers either killed, injured or left seriously ill. It became a nightmare scenario as the US and oil-rich Islamic countries such as Saudi Arabia began to finance anti-communist fighters there. Eventually, this chaos and massive expense on the Soviet Union contributed to its collapse in the early 90s. The conflict in Afghanistan also had wider implications in regard to arms control between the superpowers. President Carter met Leonid Brezhnev, the Soviet Union president, and signed the SALT II Treaty, the Arms Limitation Treaty, on the 17th of June 1979. The Arms Limitation Treaty basically established numerical equality between the two nations in relation to nuclear weapons delivery systems. 2 weeks later, on the 3rd of July, Carter approved Operation Cyclone to fight communism in Afghanistan. The aftermath of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan a few months later, in December of that year, the US Senate refused to ratify the SALT II Treaty. Nevertheless, both Washington and the Soviets both kept to the spirit of the agreement despite the failure to ratify. In a broader sense, Afghanistan was seen by both superpowers as an important strategic location in terms of future access to oil and other materials in Central Asia. Brzezinski continued to press Carter to take a tough line against the Soviets, and in January 1980, just a couple of months later, the president issued a statement known as the Carter Doctrine. In it, the president stated that the United States would use military force if necessary to defend its interests in the Persian Gulf region. That meant, in effect, that access to oil in Central Asia was considered of vital national interest to the United States. It was obvious by then that communism would never threaten the Islamic world, and that the Soviet Union experience in Afghanistan was beginning to weaken it as a global power. In the aftermath of the Vietnam War, Carter developed closer relationships with China. Greater trade levels were developed between the two countries. Carter also agreed to share military intelligence with China following the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. The president also developed full diplomatic relations with China, and the new Taiwan Relations Act defined relationships between the US and Taiwan. In relation to East Timor, the East Timor crisis continued during the Carter presidency. Ford and Kissinger had agreed to the invasion a couple of years earlier, and Indonesia was seen as an important American ally. American weapons were continued to be sold to the Indonesians. This was in serious conflict with Carter's human rights principles. However, some historians and political scientists believe his commitments to human rights was dominated by the State Department's more long-term strategic planning. In relation to the Panama Canal, Carter came to the presidency with a strong commitment to human rights and fairness to all nations. He campaigned on the basis of returning the Panama Canal to the control of that nation. This was an immensely difficult treaty to negotiate. There was intense debate in Congress and in the Senate in relation to this issue. Many senators were concerned with the terms of the original agreement. Panamanian sovereignty and the United States' withdrawal from the region were the main talking points. There was ongoing concern in regard to America's right to interfere in the future. Eventually, a compromise solution was agreed whereby the principle of Panamanian sovereignty was established subject to American intervention in exceptional or extreme circumstances. It was one of the president's finest achievements, and it shows his commitment to justice, even when dealing with much weaker nations. In relation to Iran, the Iranian leader known as the Shah of Iran was a puppet both of British and American oil interests. By the late 1970s, students and rebels were outraged with the brutal treatment by the Shah's government. By early 1979, a conservative Islamic group had become so strong that the Shah had to flee the country. Ayatollah Khomeini, the Muslim religious leader, returned from Paris to become the new leader of Iran. The Shah went to New York to America for cancer treatment, and this further outraged students who demanded his return for trial in Iran. They captured the US embassy in Tehran and seized 63 American hostages. Carter got involved in detailed negotiations to release the hostages, but they got nowhere as the rebels continued to change their demands. Finally, Carter approved a rescue operation known as Operation Eagle Claw in April 1980. However, the mission had to be abandoned after a helicopter crashed in the remote desert in Iran. In fact, 8 servicemen were killed in the incident. The hostage crisis damaged Carter's reputation, and although he successfully negotiated the release of the hostages in the end, it was too late to save his presidency. Ronald Reagan arranged a secret deal with the Iranians and won the 1980 election in a landslide victory. Finally, in relation to domestic policy, Jimmy Carter was an extremely hard-working man who was determined to get things done. However, he had a poor relationship with Congress, who were influenced strongly by the big energy lobby groups. He deregulated the airline industry, which led to cheaper fares and a big increase in interstate travel. The Motor Carrier Act of 1980 also deregulated the trucking industry and expanded transport industry generally. He created an explosion in the home craft beer industry by allowing breweries to produce up to 100 gallons of beer every year, home breweries. However, Carter's greatest domestic achievement was in regard to energy. By the mid-1970s, America was importing half of its oil needs. By the end of his presidency, Carter had reduced this to 40%. The new Department of Energy also focused on nuclear power and conducted extensive research into alternative energy systems. His Energy Security Act deregulated both oil and natural gas and led to a huge increase in the supply of home-based energy in the 1980s. He also created a massive increase in American stockpiles of crude oil. Several 100 million gallons of crude oil were stored in order to avoid a repeat of the chaos that was witnessed in the early 1970s. This was great for the future, but had no immediate impact and failed to win him a second term. Carter also struggled with the twin economic problems of inflation and unemployment created by the huge increases in earlier years. Like Harry Truman, he left the presidency with low opinion poll ratings, but has since come to be regarded as one of America's great presidents. As an ex-president, Jimmy Carter won the Nobel Prize for Peace in 2002 for his efforts to find peaceful solutions to conflicts around the world. He is regarded worldwide as one of America's greatest statesmen.